BBOR Black Box Online Radio, coming to you from West Virginia at heart and from around the globe. And hello, Nedheads. Hello, Black Box Battalion. Today is Wednesday, another Ripper Wednesday. Welcome to the show. How's everybody doing? On Wednesdays, I talk to you guys about Jack the Ripper, perhaps the world's most famous unsolved mystery. And you guys know the drill. You can hit the like button if you want, subscribe if you haven't, and drop a comment down below if you have something to say about Jack the Ripper. For larger things, you can send them to me at blackboxonlineradio@aol.com. And I am your host, Box Ned. In this episode, I will be discussing the book Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy by the Whitechapel Society, and this is going to be one that combines several different sources. In addition to the early sections of that book, I will also be discussing the big book of Jack the Ripper and paying special attention to an essay from that one that was written by Otto Penzler, responding to the Rippercast, and of course your questions and comments. And I have to give a shout out to Dennis G., who was the first person to inform me about the book Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy. And as you see, this is one that was shared by one of the listeners. So if you have any ideas for future episodes of Black Box Online Radio, you can put them in the comments section down below, and you know where to write the show. So, with The Terrible Legacy, I really wanted this episode to look at several different sources and really try and examine the question, what was the legacy of Jack the Ripper? Because Jack the Ripper was a serial killer that operated in England in 1888. Whatever happened before or after that is still part of the mystery. The first crime occurred on August 31st with the murder of Polly Nichols, although some people believe that it was actually in early August with the murder of Martha Tabram. Then the second crime was on September 8th with the murder of Annie Chapman, and then there was the Dear Boss letter that was mailed on September 27th, which gives us the namesake Jack the Ripper. Then we have the double event on September 30th, which saw the deaths of Liz Stride and Catherine Eddowes. Two women were murdered in one night. And then the final crime was on November 9th of 1888 with the murder of Mary Kelly. But is that Jack the Ripper's legacy, that he murdered 5 or 6 women back in 1888 and nobody was able to track him down? Nobody was able to actually apprehend the Ripper? Is that everything? What the book Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy does is it starts out by talking about how, even though this is a terrible legacy, even though these are very horrible things and the Ripper was not caught, Jack the Ripper's story also revolutionized forensic science. It revolutionized the way that people think about true crime cases. It revolutionized the way that people conduct investigations, with particular attention to victimology. And this is something that we can do when we're trying to analyze the actions and activities of the Ripper, because one thing that's stated in Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy is that almost always there is a type of connection among the victims. And I don't mean a personal connection like they know each other on a first name basis and so on, but there is some type of reason why the killer is going after these particular victims. But to ask and answer the question, do murderers most likely target people they know? That's also discussed in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy. And that book states that 86% of murder victims know their killer to a certain degree. 86%. That means only 14% of murder victims do not know the killer, and it's somebody who's completely unknown to them. Well, what do we think about that? What does this suggest about the activities and actions of Jack the Ripper? Did Jack the Ripper know some or all of the victims that were murdered back in 1888? Now, the book The Terrible Legacy really wants to zone in on a particular point. That 14% of murder victims who are unknown to the killer really includes lots of victims that were murdered by serial killers. Serial killers will regularly target victims that they do not know, that they have no acquaintanceship with. They are only targeted because of their own vulnerabilities. And that's how Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy wants to approach the Ripper's actions. I just listed off the women that are either confirmed victims or strongly considered as confirmed victims of Jack the Ripper, and this book talks about how the killer could have entered into a type of mindset where he thought that he was a superior predator. He was some type of elevated human where he could just stalk women and he could attack them and murder them and disappear. Now, how would he have gone about that? By acting like a wolf, trying to get the sheep away from the flock. I think it actually says the lamb, to get the lamb away from the flock and bring her to the slaughter, where Jack the Ripper is going after women in populated areas. And he's trying to lure a woman to a vulnerable place. And once she's away from the crowds and there's no one else around, then he attacks her. He may have thought of himself as some type of superhuman predator, but really that's all it is, and that's all that the Ripper was trying to do. And I will reinforce that point. The victims who are unknown to the killer are very frequently the targets of serial killers, and I just think that all of those things are coming together. Now, I told you that I'm going to blend several different sources into this, and I also want to look at the victims and the suspects that have been discussed. In regards to the suspects, one that is brought up very early on is Aaron Kosminski, and I know that I talk about Aaron Kosminski a lot here on Ripper Wednesday, but one thing that's mentioned in Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy is, why are so many people zoning in on Aaron Kosminski? And an explanation that has been provided is that Aaron Kosminski was Jewish. He was a Jew from Poland. And there was very strong anti-Semitic feelings at the time. There was a strong anti-Jewish feeling at the time. And that's what this book is proposing was a big cause about why everybody was insisting that the killer was Jewish. And they're looking at how there are certain things that people will zone in on that might suggest this, but they take these clues and they just try to blow them out of proportion. And one person that is mentioned by name in the book, Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy, is Sir Robert Anderson, and it openly states that he just insisted that the Ripper was Jewish, and that's affected the thinking of other Ripperologists and historians and people who are following the Jack the Ripper case. This is also discussed in the book that I mentioned last week, They All Love Jack by Bruce Robinson, where he talks about, and like he says this very, very clearly in his book, Sir Robert Anderson was an anti-Semite, and that's why he zoned in on Aaron Kosminski, because he wanted to vilify a Jewish person. Now, I don't know if it was that extreme, because Bruce Robinson takes almost everything to the extreme in his book, They All Love Jack, but a similar sentiment is shared in The Terrible Legacy. So that's dealing with Aaron Kosminski. But there's another suspect that was mentioned in this book, and his name is Montague John Druitt, and it's not an accident that he's the one who's mentioned next, because these are the suspects from the MacNaughton Memorandum, written by Melville MacNaughton, and it states that Montague John Druitt could be viewed as a suspect in the Ripper case, but he could also be viewed as an additional victim. He was an Englishman who committed suicide at some time around the 1st of December of 1888. He put rocks into his pockets and he jumped into the river. And some people think that he did that because of his deteriorating mental state. And was he a strongly considered suspect, or should he be viewed as a victim? I, of course, think a victim. I absolutely do not think that Montague John Druitt was Jack the Ripper, and I have a couple episodes detailing all of the reasons why here on this channel. You can find them under the names Jack the Ripper, Suspect, Montague John Druitt, and that should bring you to both of them. But I told you that I was listening to the program Rippercast, which is a backlog of older Jack the Ripper podcasts that has been uploaded to YouTube, but that's just the name that you can find it under, Rippercast. And they had a guest on the program named Andy Spellick, and also known as Andrew J. Spellick, and he was talking about his suspect, Montague John Druitt, and they mentioned something that was very interesting, and I'm going to throw this to you guys as a challenge question. Do you think that Jack the Ripper could have been a homosexual? Because Montague John Druitt was somebody who worked at a school called the Valentine School, and he was also a barrister. Perhaps the barrister is the primary job, but he worked at the Valentine School as a type of teacher. And the explanation that was provided on the Rippercast was that it seems like he did not have court cases every day, even though the barrister is more or less thought to have been his full-time job. It seems like he didn't have cases every single day, which created the amount of time and opportunities to work at the school, and also he would have had the ability to earn extra money if he so needed it. And one of the things that they think drove Montague John Druitt to suicide was that he was terminated from the school for some unknown reason. And a lot of people believe that that's because he was outed as a homosexual. That was the reason why he was fired, the reason why he was sacked. And Andrew Spellick was discussing this and stating that there is absolutely no evidence to suggest that Jack the Ripper was a homosexual or that Montague John Druitt was a homosexual. There is no reason to think that Montague John Druitt was fired for being gay. That is purely an assumption. And when I look back at the episodes that I made on him in the past, I admit that. I mean, that is just something that people are creating as a form of conjecture. It's only surmise. And they're probably looking at this from the context of, well, he was 31 years old, and he was a single man, and he was unmarried. And some people might be trying to put two and two together, but we don't necessarily know that. I will grant him that completely. But I want to know your responses to the challenge question. Do you think that Jack the Ripper could have been a homosexual? Do you think that a suspect who was a homosexual should be eliminated? Maybe that's an even better way of phrasing it. Because I'm going to give the very direct answer, no. Someone should not be eliminated purely for being a homosexual. And you might be like, Black Box Ned, how could this person murder only women and exclusively women if he were a homosexual? You just talked about how the book The Terrible Legacy is saying that the case of Jack the Ripper revolutionized forensic science and victimology, yet you're going to throw out something like that? What on earth are you talking about? I just want to be very clear that someone should not be eliminated exclusively for that. And the reason is that just imagine someone who was dealing with a lot of maternal abuse, abuse from their mother, and perhaps this could be someone who is trying to live the life of a straight man, but is unable to do so. And he's dealing with very, very intense insecurity. And he's just upset that he cannot develop conventional attractions for women, and he feels a type of sexual humiliation because he is unable to do so, because he's unable to perform with women, so he takes it out on them. All of that stuff about the wolf and the lamb and pulling her away from the flock and bringing her to the vulnerable place, that could still apply to a homosexual serial killer. But I'm going to be very honest with you. Just because I said that a homosexual suspect should not be eliminated on the grounds of homosexuality alone, overall, though, I do think that the Ripper was straight. I do think that the Ripper was somebody who was a male who was attracted to women. I'm just being very clear about that. And I really don't think that that's a contradictory response. Should homosexual suspects be eliminated on that basis alone? No, I don't think so. But was Jack the Ripper most likely a straight male? Yes, I do think so. I would love to know your responses. Please put them in the comments section down below. I find that the Rippercast is a rather fascinating show, even though the episodes are a little bit older. And as I said on a previous episode of Ripper Wednesday, they've also uploaded some that I haven't heard that go as far back as 1995. And one of the suspects that they were discussing was Robert Dunstan Stevenson, and I really do think that that was just an eye-opening episode. And I did a standalone episode where I incorporated some of their material into it, and they pretty much did a flat-out debunking of Robert Dunstan Stevenson. I invite you guys to check out Rippercast as well as listen to my episode. But they also did one on the murder of Martha Tabram, which again occurred in early August of 1888. Martha Tabram is thought by many to have been the first victim of Jack the Ripper, and I told you guys on a previous Ripper Wednesday that I'm about 80% certain, but the whole time during their discussion on Martha Tabram, they're talking about how she was 39 years old, and she was murdered on more or less the first floor landing of a building, which would be like going up a staircase into the building, and how a staircase would go to the next floor, and there's a type of flat area where you could walk in between the two staircases, and that's where her body was found. She was stabbed 39 times. And the entire time, during their presentation, they were talking about how she was stabbed 38 times with one knife, and then the killer switched to a larger knife to give the final stab wound, to inflict the final stab wound, to give the final blow. He switched to a larger knife, and this episode is about an hour long, and I'm just kind of sitting back, just giving long sighs, exhaling air, going, and it wasn't until about 48 minutes into the episode when they finally said, not everyone is in agreement with that there were two different knives used in the murder of Martha Tabram. Some people think that the final blow was used by the same knife, just with an extreme amount of force, and that it was performed in a different way. And I was thinking, yes, okay, finally, now we've got to the important point, because when I read about the murder of Martha Tabram, that is one of the first things that I notice. Not everyone is in agreement that two knives were used in that attack. 38 stab wounds were inflicted upon her with one knife, and then the killer switched to a different knife. You might find that, and people might claim that and provide their reasons, but not everyone is in agreement on that. And this is another very big reversal that I had about the Jack the Ripper case, where when I first heard that story, I thought, absolutely not. Jack the Ripper mutilated his victims. Stabbing someone 39 times isn't the same as disemboweling or pulling out someone's intestines, but you could see about how a killer could escalate in violence. And the time frame matches up very, very easily to the murder of Polly Nichols, which is only 3 weeks later. But also on Rippercast, they were discussing a book that I've mentioned on Ripper Wednesday before, and it's called Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia by John J. Edelston. I absolutely recommend this book, and there are a couple reasons for that. But first, they said a lot of them had read the book, Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia by John J. Edelston, but there was a particular problem with it, and that's that after it was scrutinized, they found that there were several errors in the book, and they didn't go into extreme detail about what they were. But I'm really glad, though, that book gets put under the microscope, because if you do read Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia, there is a section in there where John J. Edelston attempts to correct all of the errors that were made by other Ripperologists and authors of Jack the Ripper books. He'll just give the title and say what he thinks about the book, and say this book contains the following errors. And I think if anybody is going to do that, then they've opened up the floor to be scrutinized, and they are welcoming other people to scrutinize their own book and to challenge their book, because if they're going to go to that level, then it should also be done to them. And I don't mean that in a vengeful way, I really don't. It's just that if you're going to try and play that particular type of game, you should not be immune to that. If you're going to try and make lists of the errors in everybody else's book, then people should also be trying to examine your own book purely for the sake of fairness. But I loved Jack the Ripper, an Encyclopedia, and it's one of the books that I recommend the most, mostly because of the formatting, about how it has Jack the Ripper information, it has suspect profiles, it has suspect ratings. And you can hear about that in my episode, The Encyclopedia of Jack the Ripper Suspects, where I talk about John J. Edelston's ratings of suspects on a scale of 0 to 5. And then, of course, it has the book review sections, which I've discussed in several different episodes here. And the final thing, though, from Rippercast, they did an interview with an individual named Philip Hutchinson, who is the author of the book Jack the Ripper Location Photographs. And they were talking about the evolution of London going back from the 1800s to the 20th and 21st century. And one thing that he pointed out was the Jewish East End in Whitechapel is almost completely gone. It has just been removed, eviscerated, and rebuilt. I think that is extremely tragic, because perhaps that could have provided either a lot of clues or a lot of insights into what people were thinking from the opposite side, because I'm not convinced that the Ripper was Jewish. I've talked about Jewish suspects before on this channel, but I'm definitely not completely convinced I'm just approaching it with an open mind. And I think it's very unfortunate that certain clues like that could have been lost. And another thing that was tied to that was, how do we preserve the relics, the artifacts, the information, the photographs, and the primary sources related to the Jack the Ripper case, because this episode is about the legacy of Jack the Ripper. And a challenge question was also posed to Philip Hutchinson, and that was, should they create a repository where they could just store Jack the Ripper artifacts? You could call it a museum, and they were using the words repository and museum almost interchangeably. But should they create some type of location that is just going to be a giant vault of Jack the Ripper artifacts? And Philip Hutchinson, author of Jack the Ripper Location Photographs, simply said, that's a great idea, but it probably wouldn't work. And also, so many of the artifacts and photographs and first-hand items that are first-hand sources, primary sources, are in the possession of private collectors that they probably would not want to give that up. So there is something about how that just might not be the most feasible thing to put into action. He also made a very interesting statement about how if somebody is a private collector and they have photographs of England from 1888, of Whitechapel from 1888, specifically Jack the Ripper related photographs, then it would be unethical if they did not share them with a museum or share them with Ripperologists to a certain degree. And even for the fact that maybe they could make some other type of copy, but if someone is going to hold on to it purely for themselves, that's unethical. And part of me was very surprised about that at first, because I was like, well, I mean, it's their private property. How on earth could you ever force somebody to do that? But then I thought about it a little bit more, and I realized that this is a murder investigation. This is an unsolved case. I know that it goes all the way back to 1888, but it's still a murder investigation all the same. So yes, there is something that would be unfair and inappropriate about holding on to a piece of evidence and not sharing it with anyone, ever. When somebody dies, they can just pass it on to their descendants, and that person will also not share them. At the very least, make it very public about what the evidence is, what the photograph is, what the artifact is, and allow people to document it, allow people to store it, allow people to locate it, and keep it in some type of registry. It doesn't mean anyone would have to surrender their own private property, but just let other people know all the details about it. And that would be just my take on the subject. But it's a really interesting challenge question. And, this is a legacy episode, so you can give your responses to that in the comments section down below. But this is also some material that I don't talk about too frequently here on Black Box Online Radio. What is the legacy of the story? Mostly on BBO War, the two things that I do are look at the psychological aspects of a true crime case, and of course looking at the literature that is surrounding the case. And yes, that is kind of like this episode, looking at the book Jack the Ripper, The Terrible Legacy. But on Rippercast, they asked a challenge question that was purely relevant to the psychology of serial killers. And I know that this episode is just going to be overrun with challenge questions, but this is one that I could not resist. And it was, are there real copycat killers? And what this means is, they even clarified by stating that there are no copycat killers. Like to say that, for example, maybe somebody murdered Emma Smith in the spring of 1888, and then somebody decided to commit a murder because of the news coverage in August of 1888. Or better yet, maybe somebody murdered Martha Tapram in August of 1888, and that triggered an idea in Jack the Ripper's mind to murder Polly Nichols 3 weeks later. Something to that effect. And the response from Rippercast was, there are no copycat killers. Someone is either a murderer or they are not. And I would love to know your responses to that statement. That's, one of the many challenge questions of this episode. And at first, I thought, I completely understand what someone is saying. I completely understand the feelings associated with that statement. I get where the person is coming from. What they're saying is that this person already had a reason why they are going to be a killer. Yes, they might have been choosing the exact time because of something in the news. Yes, they might have chosen a particular method because they were exposed to it. Well, they're going to be exposed to some type of method some way, somehow. Humans learn organically. We gather information. And, if they weren't committing crimes by knife like Jack the Ripper, then they would have committed a crime by gun, or maybe a crime by rope or something, or maybe even a crime by blunt force trauma because they had seen somebody else do it. So what this person is saying is, all right, let's get to the point. There are no copycat killers. There is a genetic predisposition to commit murder. Like, there is something in that person's genes. There is a neurological issue where this person is experiencing some type of hormonal imbalance where they feel that if they were to commit the murder, they would get a certain type of stimulation from committing the crime. And then they're going to rationalize it by saying that if they do this, it's done for a good reason, not for their own neurochemistry, not because of their own personal vendetta, not because they believe that they were owed something by this individual, by this group of people, like, say, women, for example. Women have betrayed me. Women denied me the life that I wanted, so I'm going to get revenge on women. Or society betrayed me. I'm going to get revenge on society. Some type of vendetta like that. But that's all just stemming from the fact that this person had homicidal tendencies to begin with. I know exactly what they were talking about. They're saying that if this person had homicidal tendencies, there are no copycat killers. This person is just waiting for a means, motive, and opportunity to unleash their homicidal tendencies on their victims. And this is all coming back to the victimology thing that was discussed in The Terrible Legacy, about how this person has a reason why they are choosing the victims. And it could be for vulnerabilities, it could be because of internalized rage, and it could be because of a very specific personal reason, but they're unleashing their homicidal tendencies all the same. I knew the exact message that was meant to have been conveyed. But I still have to say, yes, there are copycat killers. Has somebody not tried to imitate Jack the Ripper? Has somebody not tried to have become a 20th century Jack the Ripper? How about the Zodiac Killer of California? And even worse, if you want to talk about Zodiac Killer copycats, the Zodiac Killer had a direct copycat in the city of New York, the New York Zodiac Killer, and his name was Eddie Seda. He was caught and apprehended and convicted. I mean, he was trying to be an actual Zodiac Killer that's targeting people because of their astrological signs, so that's a calculating issue. Think about what we said, though, in The Terrible Legacy, about how 86% of murders are with somebody who is known to the killer, but 14% are not, and the ones who are not are heavily, heavily connected to these serial killer stories. That guy didn't necessarily know the victims. They think he may have obtained the information about their star signs before killing them, or he might have just been lucky about opening their wallets after they had been murdered and looking at their birth dates and just checking to see if he had the right birth date, then taking credit for it. But that is an example of a direct copycat killer. Also, people who want to copycat Columbine. The Virginia Tech shooter Cho Sung openly stated that his heroes were Eric Harris and Dylan Klebold. The Columbine shooters. Multiple people, multiple mass shootings in America have been committed because they're paying homage to the Columbine shooters. They're done as copycat crimes. I completely agree with everything that was said on Rippercast about how these people have some type of desire to kill, some type of urge to kill, or it's even just some type of motivation to kill, and it might not even be something that would be purely conscious if it's genetic, if it's in their genes. They have a genetic predisposition to violence. So, if you want to hear a very big nutshell of my version of the answer, that would be: are there copycat killers? Yes, but that isn't the heart and soul of the issue. I completely agree that the heart and soul of the issue is some people are violent and destructive, and they are going to act out these violent and destructive ideological creations in the external world. But yes, let's be clear. There are copycat killers. What do you think about that? And would you like to challenge me on anything that I have shared in that little rambling statement there? And right now in this episode, I would like to respond to a couple comments that you guys left on some previous Ripper Wednesdays, and the first one comes to us from James Corlett, who actually sent this into the episode 2 weeks ago, and he was talking, the episode was called Dr. Thomas Bond's Report. Dr. Thomas Bond, of course, performed the autopsy on Mary Kelly, the final victim of Jack the Ripper, and he was actually talking, though, about a different crime that took place, and that was the double event, September 30th, 1888, and this relates to the Ripper hoax theory, the idea that Jack the Ripper did not write the letters that were associated with his namesake, as well as with the ones that provided the things like the kidney, the From Hell letter, and of course the Saucy Jackie postcard, which came in between the Dear Boss letter and the From Hell letter. But this is a comment from James Corlett that says, "It's very, very likely a journalist wrote the letter giving the monster his name, Jack the Ripper. So why is it so hard to believe the Star also was behind the killings soon after, at arm's length, obviously? Hello, Ned." Well, hello to you too, James. But that really is something that stood out to me because, I mean, I've talked a lot about the Ripper hoax theory, and I've also talked about the suspects in the Ripper hoax theory. Thomas Bullen is one. Frederick Best was the one I talked about a lot in 2022. And earlier this year, I even did a suspect episode on Harry Dam. He was an American who had worked with the San Francisco Examiner, who was in England, who was also a suspect in hoaxing the letters. I repeat, hoaxing the letters. But what I said during the episode was, it's so odd to me that the Dear Boss letter comes on September 27th of 1888, and if it were a hoaxer, how would the hoaxer know that the killer was going to operate on September 30th, like 3 days later, when the killer has been completely dormant for 2.5 weeks, and then 3 days after this letter is received at the Central News Agency, the murders start again. But let's look at the comment here. Wouldn't this be something for a novel if a newspaper like The Star, and Frederick Best worked at The Star, somebody like him was behind one of the murders where some people are thinking, okay, the crimes have not started again, and the letter has been sent, but if a murder is not going to be committed, people won't think that there is a real Ripper on the loose. They're going to stop buying newspapers. We've had so much success. There has been a boom in the sales of newspapers and the circulation of papers, and this whole Ripper mania is running wild, not only throughout London, but also throughout the country, and ultimately throughout the world, getting international coverage. So, a journalist who works for a paper like The Star, maybe somebody like Frederick Best, or even someone like Harry Dam, commits the murder of Liz Stride. And the reason why I say Liz Stride is because her body was not mutilated, and then the real Jack the Ripper picked up Catherine Eddowes 15 minutes later in Mitre Square, also committed a murder on the exact same night, September 30th of 1888, and then the journalist would just be like, "Oh my goodness, what just happened?" You know, James Corlett, maybe you should send this to Stephen Hunter, author of I, Ripper, a book that I talked about a lot during the early parts of the year here on Black Box Online Radio for Ripper Wednesday. Maybe you should send that to Stephen Hunter and see if he wants to write another Jack the Ripper novel. I think that would fit in very nicely with his train of thought. And next I would like to read an email that came to us from Dr. Chad, who has responded to a lot of the Ripper Wednesday episodes, and this one was also a direct response to the one that I did on Dr. Thomas Bond's report. And Dr. Chad writes, "Hi Ned, your Ripper Wednesday was extremely thought-provoking, and I have 2 reactions." And this is going to be talking about how Dr. Thomas Bond performed the autopsy on Mary Kelly. And I think that my biggest takeaway from Dr. Thomas Bond's report is that he believed that the Ripper did not have medical knowledge, and not just saying that he's not a medical doctor. Dr. Thomas Bond even stated that he thought Jack the Ripper didn't have the knowledge of a slaughterer, someone who would slaughter horses, or even a butcher. And let's go back here. I have 2 reactions. Bond's opinion that the killer didn't even have the skill of a butcher or a slaughterman, in my opinion, is unduly influenced by his examination of the Mary Kelly crime scene, and the only body that he had the opportunity to inspect was Mary Kelly's. This was such overkill that no doubt it didn't look like anything a butcher or a slaughterman would do as part of the occupation. Even if Kelly had been the first one murdered, and opened efficiently, how could you tell with that level of mutilation? I completely understand how the doctor could have looked at that horrific crime scene and thought that this maniac was the work of an unskilled sexual maniac. But here is the sexual frenzy, and he may have mastered the skill. Number 2. There is little reason to believe that Aaron Kosminski, perhaps the prime suspect in the Jack the Ripper case, was a non-English speaking idiot who ate garbage out of the gutter in 1888. And the reason why this is included is, I mean, this just happens time and time again. I would actually challenge you guys, and I know there are enough challenge questions in this episode already, but if you were to just put Aaron Kosminski into Google and to read up about him, and you want to try and find the reasons why people think that Aaron Kosminski was not Jack the Ripper, you'll see and hear stuff like, well, you know, Kosminski didn't like to bathe and he ate food out of the gutter, and I don't think that's the way the Ripper was. Those type of behaviors didn't start until after 1888. As you discussed, these are Dr. Chad's words now. As you discussed, his appearance in court clearly shows that not only could he speak English, he was also witty and drew laughs from the audience. I will add here a detail you omitted. Aaron Kosminski appeared in court in December of 1889, over a year after the Kelly murder, so Kosminski clearly had the mental capacity to be the Whitechapel murderer, and if he was an absurdity of the case, and it would be that Jack the Ripper was finally brought to justice for walking his dog off the leash. Keep up the great work, and I love Ripper Wednesdays. And that was sent to us from Dr. Chad Galuska, and he is a professor from the College of Charleston, and he's also taught classes on Jack the Ripper in the past, so I definitely appreciate his input in all of these Ripper Wednesday episodes. But, you know, you can also give your responses in the comment section down below, and this is one of the reasons why I've never discredited Aaron Kosminski as the Jack the Ripper suspect. And if anything, though, I comprehend about how some people were saying that anti-Semitism and anti-Jewish feelings were strong at the time, therefore they probably were zoning in on Kosminski for a reason. I ignore all of that. I look at the psychological profiling markers around Aaron Kosminski, and I don't want to dismiss him, and if anything, he goes to the top of the list for me. But I would love to know what you guys think. And Aaron Kosminski was also mentioned in the book Killer Psychopaths. And last week on Ripper Wednesday, I played about a 5-minute episode that I had made responding to the book Killer Psychopaths, which talks about Jack the Ripper amongst other stories. It's written by Paul Rowland. And if you're listening this far into the episode, I want to ask you guys something that is not a challenge question. I just want to know what you guys think. And would you be interested in hearing a weekly segment about Jack the Ripper books here on YouTube? Because I was thinking about starting a new channel that was solely dedicated to Jack the Ripper books, and doing it once a week, maybe on Saturdays or Sundays. I would put out a single episode that would be done in a different format, not like Black Box Online Radio. It would be purely scripted, and everything would be lined up, transitions, and the accurate photos would be in place. And I made the first one for Killer Psychopaths by Paul Rowland, looking at his Jack the Ripper section, but part of me was thinking that I might be at the point where I should just release it on Black Box Online Radio, and that's what I would like to talk to you guys about now. Listeners of Ripper Wednesday, would you like to hear a weekly segment on Saturdays or Sundays about Jack the Ripper books that would be just about 5 to 7 minutes long, book reviews, and very condensed and informative? Maybe informative is a little bit too much of a pat on the back, but condensed and to the point videos talking about some of the Jack the Ripper books that are mentioned here on Ripper Wednesday. And I'm also going to add this as a polling question that will be shared to the audience of Black Box Online Radio later today. So I just want some feedback for you guys, because I make these episodes and you guys are the ones listening to them, so I would really love to know what you think. But a big difference, though, between Jack the Ripper and other true crime cases, or maybe among the other cases, I should say, is that there are so many books that have been written about Jack the Ripper. And I learned early on that there was definitely a world of information out there, and perhaps a solid response to that challenge question about should they create a Jack the Ripper repository for evidence. I mean, I mostly agree with Philip Hutchinson. It would be perhaps somewhat impractical, but one thing that would be extremely practical would be to create a Jack the Ripper library, because there are just countless Jack the Ripper books that are out there. And even one point that was discussed on Rippercast, I actually found this to be a little bit amusing, was that there are lots of Jack the Ripper tour companies. There are lots of tour guides that give walkthroughs of the crime scenes, and maybe Jack the Ripper Tour is the first one that comes to mind for many of us, run by Richard Jones. He's been a guest on Black Box Online Radio in the past, but they were talking about what type of guests go on these tours, what type of people go on these Jack the Ripper tours, and Philip Hutchinson said that when there is an American on the tour, they immediately want to talk about Patricia Cornwell and her books, such as Portrait of a Killer and Walter Sickert as a Jack the Ripper suspect. And if somebody is British, then they want to talk about Stephen Knight and The Final Solution, which is also going to be talking about Walter Sickert to a certain degree. And he just noticed that pattern existed over and over again. Americans love Patricia Cornwell, and I do admit she is extremely famous in America, and I guess the British people have taken a liking to Stephen Knight. But in regards just making this episode and series and like just a regular segment, I've also talked to you guys about starting something called the Double Event here on Black Box Online Radio, a second Jack the Ripper segment, and I think that a 5 to 7 minute episode would be very, very doable for me and for the channel. And it would also be something where I could fulfill that agreement to make the double event, but I wouldn't be charging any money for it. No membership required. This would be just something to discuss because I'm absolutely fascinated by all of these different Jack the Ripper books out there, and I would love to know your feedback. And the final thing that I have for you guys is, if we're going to talk about books, there is the big book of Jack the Ripper. This is a book that you can find online for free. You can also get it on YouTube in its audiobook format. And there's an introductory essay in the book, The Big Book of Jack the Ripper, by Otto Penzler, and he talks about some of the reasons why Jack the Ripper is so much more popular than other serial killers. This episode is on the legacy of Jack the Ripper, and I thought that he wrote about it in a very odd way when he talked about how Jack the Ripper is a serial killer that is very famous, but he's not one who has morphed into some type of silly caricature. Jack the Ripper is someone who is still an icon of fear, terror, and when Jack the Ripper is depicted, people often look at how he is walking around the foggy streets of London. He is someone who is described as very horrific, and Jack the Ripper was a very, very horrific serial killer who just mutilated women like Mary Kelly almost beyond recognition. I agree with all of that. But some of the famous people out there, famous murderers and serial killers and criminals out there, get turned into almost lovable figures. And what he talked about was gangsters such as Al Capone and John Dillinger. They're thought of as criminals who were somewhat cool. And then there are other people out, though, that he brought up, like Charles Manson and Jeffrey Dahmer. And he said, though, like, they are the icons of psychopathy. Like, they're just like the examples of a psychopath that Americans would turn to. And I think that's really odd that he would bring up those particular cases, Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson, because I think that both of those people, Dahmer and Manson, have just been turned into silly parodies. If you get on Facebook, you can find memes about Jeffrey Dahmer where people are making fun of him. Yes, he was a cannibalistic serial killer, but people just start mocking him to no end. Charles Manson might even be more famous for his prison antics than the Tate LaBianca murders, and I'm not joking, because when he would do interviews in prison, he was extremely silly about it, and he gets up and he starts dancing, and he starts, singing his own type of music, music, and then he also would just do kung fu sometimes, and Manson said that that was all by design. I completely admit that Manson was a clinical psychopath, and they even examined his brain, and they were just like, yeah, this guy was perhaps a born psychopath, and trauma in his life, the traumatic experiences in his life, drove him to become someone who would organize these types of murders that he was ultimately convicted for. But he was the type of person who said that it was all by design. He's like, the reason why people want to keep hearing from me is because every time I'm interviewed, I do something different. But ultimately, that just turned into him doing silly things. Like I said, dancing, kung fu, just singing, out of nowhere in the middle of an interview, and not to mention his epic question and his epic answer, and, just saying stuff like, I'm a tramp, I'm a bum, a hobo, I'm a boxcar and a jug of wine. And, he just talks in this type of roundabout way where he never gets to the point, but yet he's still saying certain words that are attracting people. And, Manson actually is a very fascinating case because that is not purely arbitrary. Manson learned a lot about that from Scientology and also from other people in prison about how they do certain manipulative tactics. And this is something that I was even discussing yesterday on the Zodiac True Crime Talk Radio episode, where when people are psychopaths, they have a tendency to learn more about what other people want to hear, or at least they think they know what other people want to hear, and then they can gauge people's personalities, and this is the type of person who wants to receive this type of message. He's being interviewed. He's going to be on TV. He's going to do something silly, and people will remember it. And I don't think there's a lot of depth to it, but it's something that gets overlooked very easily. Two other criminals that were brought up in the big book of Jack the Ripper that Otto Pensler wanted to compare Jack the Ripper to were Adam Lanza and Andrew Kehoe. And Adam Lanza is someone whom Otto was openly asking, has Jack the Ripper been someone who will never be forgotten? Because the American public might completely overlook certain criminals, such as Adam Lanza and Andrew Kehoe. They both committed mass murders in schools. Adam Lanza, of course, the Newtown shooting, Sandy Hook, and Andrew Kehoe, the Bath School massacre. And I don't think that Adam Lanza has been forgotten. I don't think that he's been overlooked. And I think that most Americans would probably know who Adam Lanza is, or at the very least, they would know who the Sandy Hook shooter was. And there was a very high-profile lawsuit that was involving Alex Jones that took place. So Sandy Hook was in the news for a multitude of reasons. Number one was that Adam Lanza was somebody whom they ignored all the warning signs from. His mother really hid a lot of the destructive tendencies that he had, and she exacerbated his mental illnesses. And ultimately, though, that's most likely what was happening with Adam Lanza. He had a combination of mental illnesses, and he did not get the treatment and or commitment that he needed. But with somebody like Jack the Ripper, it's impossible to say because we don't know the true identity of the Ripper. Now, with someone like Andrew Kehoe, I don't think that the average American would know who he is. Even if you talk about the Bath School massacre, which occurred in the 1920s, then they might not be aware of that one. I've done one episode about him here on this channel, and it wasn't even on the Bath School massacre, which was committed with dynamite, actually, with explosives. It wasn't even a shooting, and it wasn't on Andrew Kehoe himself. It was on the murder of his wife, Nellie Price Kehoe, and that was just a short episode. But I did look into that for a while, and the best resource that I found was a set of interviews called The Devil Came to Michigan, Bath, Michigan. And number one, I think that Jack the Ripper was absolutely more horrific than Adam Lanza. Adam Lanza was somebody who, again, was mentally ill, and he rationalized the murders and just thinking that human life is unsufferable, and he wanted to cause destruction and end his own life. I don't think that that is any type of justification. I don't even think he believed that stuff. I think, again, it's much like the copycat killer comment. This person had homicidal tendencies, and then they just found a way to use them. But I think that Andrew Kehoe was way more vicious and sadistic than Jack the Ripper. I mean, he just planted explosives in a school and blew up school children, and it was all done in a type of calculated, by design, complete awareness, and he even murdered his own wife, Nellie Price Kehoe, and there's just some very, very large disregard for humanity there that doesn't appear to be rationalized. It appears to be destruction to the nth degree, whereas Jack the Ripper definitely wanted to destroy human lives, but he did it in a very sneaky and covert way, like a wolf pulling away the lamb from the flock. Well, this guy would be like blowing up the entire farm and just killing all the sheep and lambs that he possibly could. But I would love to know what you guys think about any of the stories that were discussed, and I was just really surprised to find all of these true crime discussions going on in the big book of Jack the Ripper, talking about Jeffrey Dahmer and Charles Manson, Adam Lanza, and Andrew Kehoe. But I would love to know your responses to anything that has been mentioned in this episode. What do you think about the legacy of Jack the Ripper? And please, feel free to respond to any of the challenge questions that have been mentioned here, and maybe your comment will be worked in to a future episode of Black Box Online Radio. I talk about the Zodiac Killer on Mondays, Jack the Ripper on Wednesdays, and D.B. Cooper on Fridays. And if you want to support all of these efforts, you can go over to buymeacoffee.com, buymeacoffee.com/blackboxnid88. And that allows you to make a donation or contribution to help support the show, and anybody who makes a donation will get a shout out on Zodiac Monday. And that will be all for me now. BlackboxNed88 on TikTok and Instagram, and see you over there. Until next time.